Imagine standing in the ruins of a world that has just collapsed. Everything you believed in, everything you were willing to die for, has been reduced to ash and rubble. Now imagine discovering that the women of your nation, your mothers, sisters, daughters, are not just surviving, but finding hope with the enemy. What would you do? What some former Japanese officers did in the autumn of 1945 will leave you absolutely speechless. And the way one British soldier responded changed everything. Anyone thought they knew about honor, loyalty, and what it truly means to win a war. Before we dive into this astonishing true story, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. This is a story that transcends borders, and I want to know how far it reaches. What I'm about to share with you is not just another war story. This is about the moment when two worlds collided, when the ancient code of Bushido met the compassion of a man who had every reason to hate, when pride faced humility, and when the true cost of blind obedience was finally revealed. The events that unfolded in a small district outside Yokohama in November 1945 would test the very soul of a defeated nation and prove that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on the battlefield, but in choosing forgiveness when vengeance would be so much easier. This story has been buried for decades, whispered about in families but never fully told. Until now. His name was Captain James Hartley, and if you saw him walking through the devastated streets of post-war Japan, you might have dismissed him as just another British officer doing occupation duty. 32 years old, with tired eyes that had seen too much, and a quietness that set him apart from the boisterous soldiers around him. But James Hartley was anything but ordinary. While most Allied soldiers couldn't speak a word of Japanese and had no interest in learning, Captain Hartley was fluent. Not just conversational, fluent. He could read classical poetry, understand regional dialects, and speak with a formal elegance that shocked every Japanese person who heard him. Where did a British officer from a small village in Yorkshire learn to speak Japanese like a scholar? The answer was as heartbreaking as it was extraordinary. Before the war, James had been a missionary teacher in Hiroshima. He'd fallen in love with Japan, its culture, its people, its profound sense of beauty and impermanence. He'd fallen in love with Akiko, a schoolteacher who taught him that true strength wasn't about dominance but about service. They married in 1938 against the warnings of both their families. For 3 years, they built a life together, a small bridge between two worlds that were hurtling toward catastrophic collision. When war broke out, James was evacuated. Akiko couldn't leave. Her aging parents depended on her. James tried everything to bring her to England, but the bureaucracy, the politics, the sheer impossibility of it all. He was still trying when the bomb fell on Hiroshima in August 1945. Akiko was visiting her parents that day. They were less than a mile from ground zero. James volunteered for occupation duty in Japan before the war had even officially ended. While other officers saw the Japanese as a defeated enemy to be managed and controlled, James saw a people in unimaginable pain. The same pain that hollowed out his chest every morning when he woke up remembering that Akiko was gone. In early November 1945, Captain Hartley did something that shocked his fellow officers and scandalized the British command. He opened a community center in a bombed-out school building. Not a military facility, not an interrogation center. A place where Japanese civilians, especially women who had lost everything, could come for food, medical care, and safety. The British command was furious. "You're fraternizing with the enemy," his commanding officer barked. "You're making us look soft. These people need to learn respect through discipline, not charity." But James didn't see enemies when he looked at the hollow-eyed women clutching malnourished children. He saw Akiko. He saw the life he'd lost and the world he'd failed to save. He opened the center anyway, defying direct orders. He used his own rations. He recruited Japanese volunteers. He created a space where humanity could begin to heal. The women came. Slowly at first, suspicious and afraid. But word spread. There was a British officer who spoke their language, who bowed respectfully, who didn't look at them with contempt or lust, but with something that looked impossibly like kindness. Within weeks, dozens of women were coming daily. They brought their children. They began to smile again. Some even laughed, and that's when the former officers began to notice. Colonel Takeshi had been a decorated officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. 53 years old, rigid as iron, with a face carved by decades of military discipline. He had led men into battle believing absolutely in the divine mission of the Emperor, in the superiority of Japanese spirit over Western materialism. Surrender had not broken his belief. It had calcified it into bitter resentment. He gathered with other former officers in a sake house that had somehow survived the bombings. Lieutenant Saito, young and burning with humiliation at Japan's defeat. Sergeant Yoshida, thick-necked and violent, whose entire identity had been wrapped up in military honor. And others, a dozen men who refused to accept that their world was over. Have you seen it? Colonel Takeshi's voice was low, dangerous. Our women, going to that British compound, taking food from the enemy's hand like dogs begging for scraps. It's shameful, Lieutenant Saito spat. They dishonor their husbands, their fathers, everyone who died for the emperor. I've heard they're learning English from him, another officer muttered. That they laugh with the British. Soldiers, it's disgusting. Sergeant Yoshida cracked his knuckles. Someone needs to remind these women of their duty, of loyalty. Colonel Takeshi's eyes were cold. Yes, someone does. The confrontations began subtly. Women returning from the community center would find neighbors refusing to speak to them. Anonymous notes would appear, calling them traitors, whores, collaborators. Some women stopped coming, but others, those who had found genuine kindness after months of fear and starvation, kept returning. Then the harassment escalated. Lieutenant Saito and two other former officers cornered a young woman named Yuki on her way to the center. 23 years old, widow of a soldier who died in Burma, carrying her infant son. Where are you going, Yuki-san? Saito's voice was deceptively polite, but his eyes were hard. To get food for my son, she whispered. Food from the British? His voice rose. Have you no shame? Your husband died fighting these people and you take their charity. My husband died for the emperor, Yuki said, her voice shaking but steady. But the emperor has surrendered. The war is over. My son is hungry. What would you have me do? Starve with dignity rather than live with shame, Saito shouted. An older woman named Tomoko stepped forward from the small group heading to the center. 56 years old, she'd lost 2 sons and her husband in the war. Her face was weathered, but her eyes were fierce. You speak of dignity, she said quietly. But what dignity is there in watching children die of hunger out of pride? Captain Hartley treats us with more respect than you men are showing us right now. The words hung in the air like a slap. Sergeant Yoshida's face flushed red. You dare compare us to the enemy? I compare actions to actions, Tomoko replied. And I know what I see. Word reached Captain Hartley about the harassment. He immediately went to Colonel Takeshi's known gathering place, walking into enemy territory, alone, unarmed, except for the moral authority of compassion. The Saik house fell silent when he entered. A British officer in the heart of Japanese pride. Colonel Takeshi, James said in perfect formal Japanese, bowing respectfully. I am Captain James Hartley. I believe we need to speak. The colonel didn't stand, didn't bow. I do not speak with occupiers. Then listen, James said calmly. I understand you're angry that women from this district are coming to the community center. I understand this challenges your sense of how things should be. But I want you to understand something. I'm not trying to dishonor anyone. I'm trying to keep people alive. Lieutenant Saito stood abruptly. You want to understand us? You, who bombed our cities, who killed our families, who destroyed everything we built? You understand nothing. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every man there was staring at James with barely contained rage. James's voice remained steady, gentle, even. You're right. I don't understand the full depth of your pain. But I understand loss. I understand what it means to lose everything you love to this war. And I understand that continuing to fight battles that have already been lost only creates more suffering. Easy words from the victor, Colonel Takeshi said coldly. Are they? James's eyes met the colonel's. What have I won? My home destroyed? My wife killed? A world that will never again be what it was? I assure you, Colonel, there are no victors in this war, only survivors. And the question before us now is what kind of world those survivors will build. Sergeant Yoshida moved toward James threateningly. You speak of your wife, but you remarry yourself with our women's trust. I remarry myself with nothing, James said quietly. I honor my wife's memory by doing what she would have wanted, showing compassion to those in need. The room exploded with outrage at his words, but Colonel Takeshi raised his hand for silence. Something in the British officer's voice, some quality of genuine grief, had caught his attention. Your wife, the colonel said slowly. You said she was killed. How? James's jaw tightened. For a moment he seemed unable to speak. Then, Hiroshima, August 6th. She was visiting her parents. Silence crashed through the room like a physical force. Your wife was Japanese? Lieutenant Saito whispered. Akiko Hartley, born Akiko Tanaka, James said. And now the grief in his voice was unmistakable. Schoolteacher. Poet. She loved Basho's haikus and the way morning light looked on the Motoyasu River. She taught me that true strength is gentleness, that honor is not about rigidity but about compassion. She taught me to see the beauty in your culture that you yourselves have forgotten in your pursuit of military glory. The silence in the room was deafening. These men had expected a conqueror, an enemy, a representative of Western arrogance. Instead, they found a man whose loss mirrored their own. Colonel Takeshi's face had gone pale. You lost your wife to the atomic bomb, and yet you show kindness to us? Not yet, James corrected gently. Because Akiko would be ashamed of me if I let her death turn me into something cruel. Because the only way to honor those we've lost is to ensure their suffering wasn't meaningless. Because revenge and hatred only create more widows, more orphans, more grief. Lieutenant Saito's anger hadn't fully dissipated. Beautiful. Words. But words are cheap. What do you know of real sacrifice? Of honor? James looked at him for a long moment. May I tell you about August 9th? He asked quietly. The former officers exchanged confused glances. August 9th was the day the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. I was stationed in Okinawa by then, James continued. We'd heard about Hiroshima. I was not functioning well. But on August 9th, we received reports of the second bomb. That evening, I was flying. Reconnaissance with an American pilot over Kyushu. Our plane developed mechanical trouble. We crashed in the mountains, 30 miles from Nagasaki. The tension in the room shifted from hostility to unwilling fascination. The American pilot died on impact. I survived with a broken leg and burns. I crawled from the wreckage and collapsed. I should have died there, but I didn't. Do you know why? No one spoke. Because a Japanese farmer found me. An old man, probably 70 years old. He had every reason to kill me. An enemy soldier, alone, helpless. Instead, he hid me in his barn. He set my leg. He brought me food and water. For 3 days he kept me alive, even though sheltering an enemy soldier was punishable by death. James's voice grew stronger. On the 4th day, he helped me reach the Allied lines. Before I left, I asked him why. Why risk everything for an enemy? He said something I'll never forget. War makes men into demons. I choose to remain human. He paused, letting the words sink in. That man's name was Takeshi Yamamoto. He had lost 2 sons in the war. His village had been partially destroyed by American bombing. And yet he chose compassion. He chose to see a suffering human being instead of an enemy to be destroyed. Colonel Takeshi stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. His face was ashen. Takeshi Yamamoto, he whispered. From Nagano Prefecture? James nodded slowly. That was my brother, the colonel said, his voice breaking. My older brother. He died last month. Pneumonia. The shock rippled through the room. The coincidence, or perhaps fate, was staggering. But James wasn't finished. Your brother saved my life, Colonel, and before he let me go, he asked me to promise him something. He asked me to remember that the Japanese people are not the same as the Japanese military. That ordinary people, farmers, teachers, mothers, children, are victims of this war just as much as anyone else. He asked me to show them the same compassion. He had shown me. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Your brother gave me this. He said if I ever had the chance, I should find his family and give it to them. He offered the notebook to Colonel Takeshi. The colonel took it with shaking hands. He opened it and saw his brother's familiar handwriting. Poems, observations about nature, reflections on a long life. On the first page, in careful characters, was written, To my younger brother Takeshi. If you read this, it means I have passed. Remember that strength without compassion is cruelty. Remember that honor without mercy is pride. Be strong enough to be kind. That is the samurai's true path. A tear ran down the colonel's weathered face. The first crack in his iron facade. But then Sergeant Yoshida spoke up, voice still hard with suspicion. This is very moving, Captain. But how do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know this isn't a manipulation? James looked at him steadily. You don't. You can choose to believe me or not. But I can prove something else. He moved to the small upright piano in the corner of the sake house, a relic from when the establishment had been more prosperous. He sat down, his movements careful, almost reverent. Akiko loved music, he said softly. She played the koto beautifully. She used to say that music was the language that proved all humans shared the same heart, regardless of what flag they served. He positioned his hands over the keys, and then he began to play. The music that flowed from the old piano was not Western. It was a Japanese folk song, Sakura Sakura, cherry blossoms, but played with such profound skill, such deep emotional understanding, that every man in that room felt it in his bones. The melody spoke of beauty and impermanence, of loss and hope, of spring always returning after the cruelest winter. James's hands moved across the keys with the confidence of a concert pianist, but more than technical skill there was soul in every note. He wasn't just playing music. He was channeling grief and love, and the desperate hope for healing. When the last note faded, the silence was absolute. Several of the former officers had tears streaming down their faces. Akiko taught me, James said quietly. Every evening she would play and I would listen. She said that if I learned to play Japanese music with true understanding, I would never be able to hate Japanese people because I would carry their soul in my hands. He stood from the piano and turned to face them. So yes, Sergeant. You can question my words, but music doesn't lie. If I could learn to play your songs with love, can you not learn to see that the women seeking food and safety are not betraying you? They're trying to survive? Can you not see that maybe, just maybe, the real betrayal is letting pride kill what little hope remains? Colonel Takeshi sank back into his chair. His brother's notebook clutched to his chest. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. All my life I believed in the code. In discipline, in sacrifice for the greater good. I sent young men to die believing in that code. I was proud of it. He looked up at James, his eyes haunted. But you're right. The war is over, and we lost. Not because we lacked courage or discipline, but because maybe the code itself was flawed. My brother saw it. He tried to tell me even before the war, but I wouldn't listen. I called him soft, weak. His voice broke. And now he's dead, and I'll never be able to tell him he was right. Lieutenant Sato's anger had transformed into something else. Confusion, grief, the terrifying vertigo of a worldview collapsing. But if the code was wrong, then what were we fighting for? What did my men die for? James's voice was gentle. They died because they were loyal to what they believed was right. That's not worthless. But now you have a choice. You can let their deaths turn you bitter and cruel, or you can honor them by building something better, by being better. Sergeant Yoshida, who had been silent since the music, spoke up, his voice thick. I threatened women. I intimidated them. I thought I was defending honor, but I was just angry. Angry that we lost. Angry that everything I believed in was ash. He looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. What have I become? You've become what war makes of people, James said. But war is over. Now you get to decide what peace makes of you. Over the following days, something remarkable happened. Colonel Takeshi came to the community center, not to threaten, to apologize. In front of all the women, he bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect and humility that shocked everyone present. I was wrong, he said, his voice carrying the weight of true remorse. I accused you of dishonor when it is I who acted dishonorably. You were trying to protect your children, to survive, to find some human kindness in a world of ashes. And I responded with threats and judgment. I ask your forgiveness. Tomoko, the older woman who had confronted Lieutenant Sato, stepped forward. Her eyes were hard, but not without compassion. Colonel, forgiveness is not given lightly, but I see you are sincere. So I will tell you this. Earn it. Help us rebuild. Not the old Japan of rigid codes and blind obedience, but something new. Something where both strength and compassion can exist. James added quietly, Colonel, if you truly want to honor your brother's memory, I have a proposal. Help me run this center. You understand these people. You speak with authority they'll respect. Together we could do more than feed bodies. We could help rebuild spirits. The colonel looked at him, then at the women, then at the notebook his brother had left him. Slowly, he nodded. Lieutenant Saito came next, hesitant and ashamed. I don't know how to do anything but fight, he admitted. I've been a soldier since I was 17. What use am I in? Peace? James smiled. The center needs teachers. Help teach children. Channel that discipline and dedication into building up instead of tearing down. You have leadership skills. Use them for construction instead of destruction. Even Sergeant Yoshida, the most resistant, eventually appeared. I'm not good with words, he said gruffly. But I'm strong. I can carry things. Build things. He paused. Fix things I've broken. Then help us repair the school building, James said. Make it a place where children can feel safe again. Within weeks, the transformation was visible. Former officers working alongside British soldiers and Japanese civilians. Women who had been threatened now working side by side with the men who had threatened them, building something new from the ruins. The remarkable events at that small community center outside Yokohama rippled outward. Other centers followed the model. The idea that former enemies could work together, that compassion could be stronger than hatred. That transformation was possible even for those most resistant to change. These ideas spread like seeds in fertile ground. Captain James Hartley eventually returned to England, but not before seeing the center flourish into a school, a medical clinic, and a symbol of what post-war reconstruction could be when approached with humanity rather than mere occupation. Colonel Takeshi ran the center until his death in 1963, dedicating the rest of his life to peace education. Lieutenant Saito became a respected teacher. Even Sergeant Yoshida found purpose in helping rebuild what the war had destroyed. But the legacy of those months went deeper than individual transformations. It demonstrated a truth that the world desperately needed to learn. That the measure of true strength is not the ability to dominate, but the courage to show compassion when vengeance would be easier. That honor is not rigid adherence to codes that cause suffering, but the flexibility to adapt, to grow, to choose mercy. The women who trusted British soldiers weren't betraying their culture. They were saving it by refusing to let it die alongside the men who had fought. They understood something profound. Survival isn't surrender. Accepting kindness isn't weakness. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of the past and reach for a better future. What happened in that community center proved that redemption is possible, that people can change, and that the human capacity for compassion can survive even the most brutal wars. It showed that sometimes the real victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from transforming them into partners in building peace. James Hartley once said in a letter to his sister, Akiko died in the atomic blast, but her spirit lives in every act of kindness that rises from these ashes. Every time someone chooses mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred, she wins. The war took her from me, but it couldn't take the truth she taught me, that love is stronger than death, and compassion more powerful than any weapon ever forged. If this story moved you, if it challenged you to think differently about enemies and forgiveness, about strength and vulnerability, about the courage it takes to change, then hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that prove the best of humanity can survive the worst of our history. And drop a comment below. When has someone shown you unexpected compassion? When have you chosen mercy over anger? Your stories matter. Your voice matters. Because the choice those women made in 1945 to accept kindness from former enemies is the same choice we all face every day. Do we cling to old hatreds and rigid codes that no longer serve us? Or do we have the courage to transform, to forgive, to build something better? The answer determines not just our individual lives, but the future of our world. Choose compassion. Choose transformation. Choose to be strong enough to be kind.